So Linda and I have been doing the Battleground poll now for 31 years together. She is an interesting combination in that she grew up in a very Republican family. I grew up in a Democrat family, and we both changed in college to the other party. And she is certainly a progressive, not just a Democrat, she is a progressive. And I think holds that up very well. I am a conservative, but I'm not, sorry for anyone in the room I might offend, I'm not a crazy conservative. Mine is based on policy and what the party stands for, not what we're against. And I try and have tried with my candidates to do that. One of the things that I feel I've been very blessed with over the years is working for candidates that were about doing something for the people as opposed to fighting against the other side. And I think we spend way too much time in our campaigns running negative campaigns. I hate, I'll say this to the media people, I hate the media people that are saying, well, negative works. My response to that is always, well, so does positive, you ought to try it once in a while. And over the years have worked for some amazing candidates. My home state, that I consider my home state, Oklahoma, James Langford is a great example. In his first campaign, we made it very clear we were going to run a positive campaign and ran it the entire time he ran for the Senate. And I think has stuck with that ever since. Doesn't mean you won't get into discussions about differences on the issues. But one of the things, first of all, we did begin morphing a little bit the Battleground poll from a political poll because there's so many of those out there today, as opposed to 30 years ago when we started doing it, to doing a little bit more in the area of civility. What is interesting in the book is we started off with the idea of putting civility in the title, and we decided to change it to respect, because the more we looked at the issue, and it's taken us 2 years to write this book, the more we looked at the issue, we came to realize that civility, which is often thrown around, civility is just the language of respect. And so we tried to drill down a little bit more into the issue of respect in terms of what is there. I think we have a national problem, quite frankly. It's very interesting. There's a group that puts out a scatter map every 2 years of the ideology of Congress. And if you go back and look at 1990, their scatter map that they did in 1990 was kind of an even bar of dots all the way through, a little bit thicker in the middle than it was on the two ends. If you look at a scatter map for the Congress of 2020, it's all grouped at the two ends with a very thin line of dots in between. I would call it a barbell, but it's a barbell with a broken bar. There's just not many in between. The other thing we are seeing today in politics is that about 20% of Republicans vote in a Republican primary, and 20% of Democrats vote in a Democrat primary. And as much as we have people that are always throwing out redistricting and that being the problem that is there, the real problem is, I believe, is that we have a very small number of Republicans and Democrats voting in those two primaries, and they are the ideologues on the two ends of the spectrum. And so all they are offering to the American public are candidates that come from the two ends. So no wonder there's polarization. They're polarized before they even walk into the institution. And that is something that we don't address in the book. There may be a second book coming along, but it's something that I think if we care about the future of the country, I think we at some point have to analyze a different system where we involve more people having input at the front end as opposed to just at the back end of elections. So, having said that, we move to a little bit more on civility. It was interesting what drove us to that decision is we did a Battleground poll in January of 2021. And we had made a decision. I had always planned on writing the book, but I wanted to wait until Trump was gone because I didn't want the book to be Trump-centric. And I know many of you have heard me say things about Trump and my feelings about Trump in the past. But the one thing I do say is I believe he is a symptom of the problem we have. He is not the disease. And I think we as Americans have to come to that conclusion, that we have a death spiral of incivility that we have fallen into in this country that is extremely dangerous for the future of the democracy. Very dangerous for the future of democracy. And it's not driven by Trump. He's just a symptom of where we're at as a country. What was interesting is we decided to do the book together after Trump lost, because I didn't want it to be Trump-centric. But we then added some civility questions on our first battleground poll in January. The interesting thing is we went in the week of January 6th. And so we had half our survey was conducted before January 6th and half was conducted after, which made it that much more illuminating in terms of where the country was and how they reacted to January 6th. And it was a gut reaction of the public that was more about finger pointing than about what was the problem, why was that occurring, and what brought us to that point. So that brings us to doing more and writing the book. It took us 2 years. But in the survey we're releasing, by the way, for any of you, if you can kind of hold this information until Thursday. I actually told Jim that we are not releasing this publicly until Thursday morning. So in fairness to Celinda, I told her I was doing this today. She was fine with that, mainly because she went to high school with Jim, and she trusts him even more than she trusts me. But we need to hold it. We do have some environmental questions, if you will. And look, there's no question that Republicans are in a very good position today because of the environment and what that means for the campaign. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite, I was doing 4 Senate races this year. One was John Bozeman's primary. One was James Langford's primary. One was Katie Britt in the campaign and then runoff in Alabama. And so knowing that I was kind of at the end of this year was the end of my being with the firm and working publicly. I had one race that I picked that, and this goes back to a little bit of our history at Tarrance Group. One of the things I think we have done very well is each one of the 3 of us, my 2 main partners, Brian Tringali and Dave Sackett, we each picked a candidate every year that was what we kind of jokingly said in the inside, our baby race. It was someone that we did for cost. We couldn't do it for free because that would be a corporate contribution, but we did for cost. And we did that for the last 35 years to kind of keep us honest, if you will, about why we were doing what we were doing. Because we were doing it because we want to elect good people to Congress. In fact, Zach Wamp was one of my baby races in the early days. And one that I had to baby along the whole time he was in Congress. But by the way, John Boehner was also one of, I did John Boehner's first race, and another one I had to baby along over the years. And so my baby race this year is a woman that I'm sure you're all going to hear more about, Tiffany Smiley, who's running in Washington State. She is an amazing candidate. She has a great story about her and her husband, high school sweethearts. He goes to West Point. He goes to Iraq. Suicide bomber explodes himself right in front of him and blinds him. And he ends up being the first blind military officer to ever serve in the United States. It's a great story for 8 years. And she's amazing. She is truly amazing and there for all the right reasons. And we just finished a survey for her where against Patty Murray, she's only 5 points down. And yet her name awareness is only at 49%. So some of that is what people have seen so far of her. A lot of that is the environment that is creating what is out there. So on environment, I start off with right track, wrong track. Right track, wrong track, today on wrong track, is the worst I've ever seen in 35 years of polling. 77% of people say the country's off on the wrong track. 77%, 67% strongly. So that means that's not going to change overnight. A few good economic news is not going to change things. If you look at by party, 93% of Republicans, wrong track. Independents, 78%, wrong track. And Democrats, 62%, wrong track. Now, one of the things that has been interesting about Biden, and I like Biden for his campaign of unity. I think he didn't quite live up to it with the first vote, where he had 100% of the vote be for Democrats. I think he planned on, quite frankly, doing that to put that away for the progressives, because he truly is a centrist. He's not a progressive. And he kind of gave them that and planned on having the infrastructure bill be one that came in with a high number and then negotiated down with the Republicans down to a lower number, which in fact is exactly what happened. The problem he had is that on the Friday that that vote happened in the Senate, that he had 19 Republican senators vote for it. Did anyone know what happened that weekend? Afghanistan fell. And you also had problems at the border. And so if I would make any critical thing of Biden, he didn't do the basic thing any president has to do, which is, I'm going to focus on this. This is my strategy, 1, 2, 3, what we're going to do. And all of you that are in other departments, in other areas, no surprises. And he didn't emphasize with them no surprises. He didn't have them watching what they were supposed to be watching. Now, that's not taking the blame away from them, but it was a weakness in terms of the management that was there. If you look at his numbers over time, he came into office with 93% of Republicans saying they disapproved of his job before he even took office. They were polarized, they were negative, they were against him. When Afghanistan occurred, he then lost a majority of the ticket splitters, or the independents. They moved against him because they felt he was incompetent in what he was doing. But what has happened recently is that the progressives of the Democratic Party, and I always tease Celinda, even though she's a progressive, that the progressives are the Tea Party of the Democratic Party. And they're doing all the same things we saw the Tea Party doing in 2010, 2012, in terms of primaries against, they moved from going against Republicans to going against old-time Democrats who are in districts that they think once we win it, we keep it, as opposed to those that won those districts against a lot of Republicans end up losing it the next time around. So that kind of brought us to this environment where people have been just increasingly negative. By the way, two things I would say about that. One is that helps the environment we're in by the fact that the progressives are, number one, negative about Biden. Number two, they've lacked intensity. We've seen their intensity come up a little bit with the abortion issue, but that's short term. And eventually their everyday voters are going to be much more concerned about the economy than concerned about the abortion issue. By the way, one of the things the Democrats, they keep trying to, this happened good on the economy last week, this happened good on the economy this week. My experience has been that for the American public to come to a conclusion that the economy is better, you need 6 solid months of universally good news on the economy. And we're now inside that window. So any pretense on their part that we're not going to have this campaign focused on inflation and cost of living and the economy overall, and taxes actually more. The one issue we always ask is jobs. Jobs is usually where the Democrats go to, as opposed to these other economic issues when we ask. And it's very low right now. They have nothing to go to on jobs to start talking about. And talking about jobs is not going to change anything because that's not factored in. One of the things I'm surprised that Democrats have not understood on the inflation issue is that there is a gender difference on how the economy is talked about. Men talk about inflation. Women talk about cost of living. And one of the things we've always seen with women is that instant reaction to higher gas prices. And so considering what we've gone through on gas prices, that has really pushed the female vote a great deal in terms of focusing on the economy and cost of living. They're smart to focus on that, but a big difference between the two. I went through Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. We also see something interesting on vote intensity. Republicans are at 65%. Democrats are at 63%. And again, that's kind of more recent on the Democrats. The abortion issue has driven some of that intensity with Democrats. But independents are at 66%. They're the highest, and I've never seen that in polling before, that the independents are the ones that are most focused on the economy and voting in this election. Now, some of that's because they weren't happy with the last president and not happy with this president. And so they're going to come into play. The other interesting thing is on right direction, wrong track by race. White voters, 81%. 81% feel the country's off the wrong track. African Americans, 64%. So they're almost 20 points lower. But Hispanics are at 73%. And there's been some stories recently about us doing better with the Hispanic vote. Some of that has been overstated, quite frankly. And some of the polls that are doing that are somewhat questionable, but that is certainly there. And then the last group I want to mention today, and there's a couple of times I'm going to do it, for 31 years now in the battleground poll, I finally got Celinda doing that. I didn't want to give her too much insight to this, but we ask a question we don't ask, are you liberal, moderate, conservative? We ask, are you liberal or conservative, volunteer, moderate? And in the 31 years of doing it, I've never seen more than 10%. It's never gotten to double digits. It's never gotten to 10%, saying, volunteering that they are moderate. And I think the reason why I don't like to ask it is moderate very often for voters is a safe haven to go to. Well, if I'm a moderate, don't ask me any tough questions. Moderates have also been demonized by the right and the left as not caring about issues, not being well informed, not caring about anything. They're just moderate. They're nothing. So one of the things that we have done in the last 3 years is there is another step we take in that question. If they say they are liberal or say they are conservative, we then say, are you very conservative or somewhat conservative, very liberal, or somewhat liberal? And I've always instinctively known in doing that, I was looking at the ideologues on the two ends. But what I didn't do until recently is combine those that are somewhat conservative, somewhat liberal, and volunteer moderate. Anyone want to guess what percent of the population that is? It's 2/3. In this poll, 67% is in the center, centrist. And so one of the things that I think we try to do in the book is try to change the vernacular a little bit, that we call it centrist, we don't call it moderates, because it's been so demonized by the two sides. If you look at, by those three groups, very conservative, very liberal, and centrist, 96% of very conservative feel the country's on the wrong track. 73% of very liberal feel they're on the wrong track, and 73% of centrist. But in terms of likely to vote, 77% of very conservatives likely to vote, 72% of very liberal likely to vote, a 5-point deficit, and only 60% of moderates or centrist, I just look at myself, are very likely to vote. And so clearly coming out of the primary season, we have been driving the two extremes, but we're not driving any appeal for that centrist group of voters, which is 2/3 of the voters wanting to vote. We also looked at Biden's job approval. 42%, about what you've been seeing in some of the national polls, some have them down into 30s. 42% approve, 55% disapprove, but strongly approve to strongly disapprove is 18% strongly approve, 46% strongly disapprove. So it's almost a 3-to-1 margin in terms of looking at the intensity of that dislike and disapproval. So that leads to a discussion that we've been having publicly, I think a lot of the pollsters, is what we call the generic ballot. So first of all, let me give you a few premises on the generic ballot. I've always loved the way the press takes the generic ballot and goes running with a surface generic ballot. The generic ballot is hinged towards Democrats, because as much as we talk about polarization and redistricting and more Republicans taking an advantage out there, the reality is that there is, particularly in minority districts, there is a group of congressional districts that are somewhere in the high 60s, low 70s, Democrat to Republican. One of the things we had to deal with in the book was redistricting. And when I saw what Celinda was wanting to write, I was like, wait a minute. Because she basically made it the Republicans' fault if we were packing all the black votes into one district, or if we were spreading them out across all districts. Well, the reality of what's happened in the last 40 years is that we have teamed up with the NAACP, starting in 1990, on, look, you need more representation. It's not a matter of spreading your vote out. It's a matter of they're taking it and spreading it out through redistricting and watering down your vote in order to increase their support. And when we started working in states, in North Carolina, Tennessee has accepted what we've done in some of those agreements. North Carolina is the one that stands up as an example, that kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't on the redistricting. But the reality is before 1990, only 3% of the members of Congress were African American. Today, they're 12.8%. And they're 12.8% because of what Republicans did to actually allow them to pack more representation in those districts so that they could have more African American representation. And she was trying to make it, okay, you're wrong on both sides, which is what the Democrats love to do from time to time. By the way, again, going back to my point, and hopefully I'll show this a couple of times today, we were going to start calling it civility, but we came to the conclusion that civility is just the language of respect. So a lot of these discussions where we're asking for more civility, what we need to be doing is getting more respect. And that will only come by the way we act as opposed to what we say. So the generic ballot, as far as our survey, was 48% Democrat, 46% Republican, only 2 points down. Now, what history has told us over the years is any election we go into, and I spent 4 years as campaign director at Congressional Committee, any election we go into, if the generic ballot's within 5 points, that election we're going to pick up congressional seats. It's given. if it's within 2 to 3 points and somewhere in that margin, we get control of Congress. So we're now at the point that this should predict control of Congress. I do believe one of the questions I've had about the upcoming election is not whether or not we're going to win control of Congress. It's whether we're going to win it by 5 seats or win it by 20 or 25 seats. So we actually have a ruling majority in the House. I think the Senate, on all the numbers I'm looking at, is kind of a 50-50 toss. I think we've not necessarily made some good decisions on primary candidates in some of the key states we had to have it, but the environment may make up for that. So I think looking at the political environment, what's there is very much in our favor at this point. The one thing I did want to mention, and again, I hate this discussion when we get into the upper 2% versus middle class, working class, lower income. Here's the generic ballot. On middle class voters, which by the way is 63% of the electorate, middle class voters were ahead 49 to 46. Working class voters were only down 3 points, 44 to 47. And traditionally we're down with that group by about 10 points. Low income voters were down by 23 points, 63 to 40. But the most interesting one is upper class voters, which in our survey, 5% identified as upper class. We were down 43 points, 25 to 68. So, it just, and we've seen that this is the worst I've ever seen it with upper class, but it's always been a Democrat group in terms of how they're voting and what their party idea is. Again, we have to undo some of the myths. One of the questions that we had on here was about November 6th. Are you watching? Extremely, very, somewhat, not at all. 15% said they were watching extremely closely. 18% said they were watching it very closely. 29% said that they were watching it somewhat closely, and 37% said not at all. Now, no surprise, but this is where you're going to see some impact on perhaps the numbers. On the 15% watching extremely closely, only 4% of Republicans said they were watching it extremely closely. Independents, only 12%. Democrats, 27%. On watching it very closely, 8% of Republicans, 19% of independents, and 26% of Democrats. Somewhat, 26% of Republicans, 34% of independents, and 31% of Democrats. And on not at all, 60% of Republicans, not watching at all, 35% of independents, and then it goes down to only 16% of Democrats, not watching it at all. I mean, this is very definitely something that the Democrat voters are watching very closely, and the Republicans are listening to Fox News and not hearing any news about what's going on and not taking any interest in it. So then we move to some of the civility questions. And one of the questions we're trying to deal with in these surveys is, are people really beginning there's a lot of data that would indicate maybe people are trying to segregate into their own groups. I think that's probably a mislabel. I think what they're doing is they're trying to move to a bubble. I was looking to see if you're recording this. I don't want to say something about my brother on camera. They're moving to a bubble that they like. My brother, who's ex-military, he served in the military like my father, spent most of his career in the military sitting in a silo in South Dakota waiting to push a button, and got 2 masters while I was doing it, where I left 7 hours short from college to manage a congressional race for a guy named Frank Keating, who ended up governor of Oklahoma, and didn't get my degree until 3 years ago, when I got embarrassed by my daughter, who was getting all A's in college. He lives in Cupertino, California, and not quite as bad as some of the people that on January 6th were on the Hill, but I think he has been pushed, if you will, by living in an environment that no one around him represents what he believes. And I've tried to tell him for years, move to Montana, move to Wyoming, move anywhere but Cupertino, California, because you're not going to find any solace with attitudes of the people around you. And I think a lot of people are doing that. So we asked some questions that was based on, think about your close friends and family. I'm going to read you a list. For each item, tell me if all, most, or some, or none of your close friends and family share this item. And if you look at those that responded, a combination of most or all. When we asked about their religious beliefs, 53%, most or all, of the friends and family around them. Political beliefs, 59%. Close. My brother would have to say about 3%. The same ethnic group as you, 67%. Same economic class, 52%. Votes for the same candidate, 55%. In the same political party, 58%. Have the same type of job, only 14%. So people are clearly, they say demographics make everything, but people surely have shifted over the last 20 or 30 years to being in areas where it's not a matter of segregation as much as it is getting into a bubble that they feel comfortable with. And I think that becomes very important in talking about the future on gaining respect. And one of the things that I think we have to deal with as a country is that, and on the issue of respect, is that everyone has lost, the trust for institutions have gone down so much in this country. Not only trust in government, but trust in religion, trust in sports teams, trust in virtually everything they deal with. And I was kind of questioning because of my father's background. I mean, there's two other stories I tell about him. One is in 1959, we were on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic on our way to his first assignment in Europe. And the news came that his home state of Hawaii, which he had already won a Bronze Star, one of 3 that he won in Korea, the news came that Hawaii was just made a state. And he had hidden a flag in the suitcase. And we took it out in the middle of the Atlantic and sewed a star on that flag. I was 9 years old. He also had a cigar box in the suitcase. And I'm like, Dad, what's that? Oh, your mom and I plan on having more kids. And that's all he said. 2 years later, when my brother was born in Frankfurt, he shows up at the hospital. We were in Gelnhausen, which was about an hour away, so we had to be very careful about leaving in enough time to get to Frankfurt Hospital. And he shows up with that cigar box under his arm. And he asked for the head nurse, which back in those days, men were not able to go back in the delivery room. And most of the, well, I'd say probably all of the nurses were female, most of which could beat you in 8 out of 10 arm wrestling events. And he asked for the head nurse, and he says, in this box is dirt from America. And I want you to put it under the mattress, because I want my child to be born on American soil. Which is, that's respect for America. When I see us on immigration, sorry if I offend anyone, but when we start going after children that are born in this country on such a deeply rooted tradition in this country, we have to look at ourselves and say, have we lost all respect for being an American? And that's one of the things that I think is a problem in the incivility today, is that we don't respect other people for just being an American, no matter what their opinions are. And we have to get back to that. How do we develop that? We develop that by rebuilding trust in America and respect for America on what's there. So that whether people are going into their bubbles or not doesn't matter. The one thing we did find in the polling, I know I'm going long, I always do. The one thing we did see in the polling is that as pessimistic as voters are, there is a strong ray of hope in terms of optimism. And one of the things that that I've come to the conclusion of, and we kind of went into this believing that our future in terms of turning America around and this slide of incivility that we're in, this, I like to call it a death slide, is that we need to have the youth surface because they are the most optimistic about the future. They're not tainted yet, if you will. And we need to go there. But after looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, they're not going to get there naturally. We need some leaders, people like a James Langford, others like that. I dedicated the book to John McCain. Someone that puts respect and civility at the top of the list on all their interactions. Well, maybe not his interaction with Trump, but all their other interactions that are there. Because if we don't enter into it that way, we're never going to undo what the problem is in terms of trust of the American public. That we have to find solutions to their problems. We have to find solutions to their problems. Not that we push ideologically what we want, but we ideologically take what we have to the table, respect the ideology on the other side, and come to conclusions on what to find. And that's where the last question that I'm going to touch today. We asked the public, what matters do you think about political civility? Which one would you prefer? A politician who constantly fights for my values, even if this means not finding a solution very often. Or a politician who's willing to work together to get some things done, even if it means compromising on my values sometimes. The response was 30% fight for your principles. 66% fight for solutions and respect the other side. That's the optimism that is there. Somewhere we have to deal with the problem that, as I told you, 67% of the American public fits in that category of centrist. Guess where they are on this question? They're in the 90s. It's the ideologues on the two ends that are demanding a fight on the principles. And so we have to look at things like, what is the role of super PACs in this country? Because they are fighting, most often than not, on ideology, not solutions. What is cable news doing? They're fighting for eyeballs, not solutions. What are we doing in social media, which has become total disrespect for other people out there? So I think there's hope I see in this data. I think that hopefully we'll move on. And the last thing I want to say, and I'm not going to say who my presidential pick would be, although I think Tim Scott and Joni Ernst would make a great ticket. Right now, we have very little of the youth vote in this country. Very little. We have moved further and further and further away from them. There are hope. I believe whichever party comes up with it, can still be a white male, just not old. And whichever the two parties comes up with a younger, positive candidate for president is going to steal that vote away for a long, long time. And so part of, as we talk about presidential candidates, I don't know that we have that candidate looking this time. I'm praying every day that Trump does not announce for president before the November elections, because all of this is off the table if that happens. But I think in the future, I think our party has to start looking for young leaders willing to stand up in a positive way and focus on solutions, not just the fight. So, that's it.